Hi, everybody. My name is Jessel Noor. I'm the Solutions Journalism Network's Democracy Manager. Happy to introduce everyone. Welcome everyone to our session today. We know as election season has begun, there's lots of discussions about the threats to democracy, but far less has been discussed about what journalists can actually do in response to those threats. So that's why we put together a series of trainings. This is the third of 4 trainings, and we potentially could have more, to give journalists the resources and the trainings and the information they need to actually do solutions-oriented reporting on the threats to democracy. Today, we have an all-star panel, which we're going to join us in just a moment. But quickly before we start, wanted to thank our wonderful partners for helping get the word out about this series. And U.S. Democracy Day is September 15th. It's a day of action for journalists and newsrooms to raise awareness about not only the threats to democracy, but the role that the media can play in responding to those threats. So big shout out to our partners. I wanted to offer a few quick definitions for those that are not familiar. Pro-democracy reporting, according to U.S. Democracy Day, acknowledges the reality of misinformation and the slippage of democratic norms, help people engage more easily and readily with the systems designed to protect, enfranchise, and serve them. And this is a powerful anecdote to horse race political coverage, which focuses on the 2 leading political parties and sort of views our democracy as a competition, as a game between these 2 parties. But we understand a lot of newsrooms have to do that as part of their coverage, but without doing pro-democracy reporting, we're sort of losing. We're getting unbalanced. Our democracy is getting unbalanced. It's leading to polarization. Newsrooms are aware that news avoidance is a growing problem, and we want to offer some alternatives to this. And another thing you're going to hear about today is solutions reporting, solutions journalism. What is solutions journalism? Simply defined as rigorous evidence-based reporting on responses to social problems. At Solutions Journalism Network, we believe it's not enough for journalists just to report on the problems, but we need to also report on what's working in response to those problems through rigorous evidence-first reporting. And we have one upcoming session left, Lessons from Pro-Democracy Newsrooms, which is happening in a week from now. And the recordings of our previous sessions will be available. If you signed up for this event, you'll get those in your inbox. So I wanted to introduce our host today, Osita Nwanevu, who is a contributing editor at the New Republic and columnist at The Guardian. Please, Osita, take it away.
Thank you, Jessel, for that introduction. Really, really great to be here in the third in this series of terrific panels on covering democracy. Especially happy to be here with 2 great co-panelists that I'll go ahead and introduce right now. So Natalia Contreras covers election administration, election security, and voting access for VoteBeat in partnership with the Texas Tribune. She's covered a range of topics as a community journalist, including local government, public safety, immigration, and social issues. Natalia worked for the Austin American-Statesman, where her reporting focused on impacts of government policies on communities of color. She previously reported for the Indianapolis Star, where she helped launch the first Spanish-language newsletter, and at her hometown newspaper, the Corpus Christi Caller-Times. Ari Berman is an award-winning journalist, a senior voting rights reporter for Mother Jones, a fellow at the Type Media Center, and the author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America, which was named a Best Book of 2015 by the New York Times and the Washington Post, among other outlets. Ari is also the author of Herding Donkeys, The Fight to Rebuild the Democratic Party and Reshape American Politics, and the forthcoming Minority Rule, about efforts by white conservatives to entrench power in the face of a massive demographic and political shift. His stories have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Rolling Stone, The Atlantic, The Nation, Politico, and The Guardian, and Ari is also a frequent guest and political commentator on MSNBC, NPR, PBS, and C-SPAN. He also appears in the documentary films All In, The Fight for Democracy, and Slay the Dragon. So Ollie and Natalia, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. So yeah, I mean, I guess we could start very simply by asking the both of you, when we're looking up to the next election, 2024, what threats and sort of obstacles to voting rights and democracy, generally speaking, are at the top of mind for each of you? There's this kind of broad array of things people are worried about. Um, what sort of is at the front of your mind as you're thinking about what you want to cover in this next election?
Natalia, you want to start?
Yeah, I can go first. Yeah, what we've been looking at in the past year, what I've been reporting on in the past year, very locally, leading up to the November 2022 election, we saw a lot of candidates who were openly, following those claims that, the election in 2020 was rigged. And so we saw a lot of those candidates running for office at statewide offices, right? And a lot of them didn't get elected, but locally, at least in Texas, there were some that at the county level were actually elected, are still kind of, following those claims and spreading those claims still, even if at the state level, major things didn't happen. So in our reporting this past year, we kind of been keeping an eye of that because, our elections and policies at the local level are also very important, not just at the national level or at the state level. So what I personally have been following in my reporting is just the people who are behind the dais that are local, county, county and city, to be honest, city elected officials who are behind the dais at the county level, and what policies they're proposing and whether those are impacting any type of election policy. Also at the state level, in the past year, we've been reporting at VoteBeat, at least in Texas, that state lawmakers are also listening to misinformation, are listening to conspiracies, and are proposing laws based on that. We had a legislative session this year, and so laws that already enacted that went into effect September 1st will impact elections in the coming years. So those are kind of some of the things that we're looking at right now.
Well, I would say that most people and most journalists are going to be focused on one thing for the next year, which is Trump, where it's going to be all consuming. The fact that we have most likely the Republican presidential nominee will be facing 4 trials next year, and that's going to dominate all of the coverage and all of the media. And so what I'm going to be focused on is all of the other things that are shaping American democracy, a lot of which relates to Trump, but some of which does not. And some of which existed before Trump, some of which has gotten worse with Trump, some of which has gotten worse because of Trump. But I would say that we are facing in our democracy right now a toxic combination of voter suppression, election subversion, gerrymandering, and outright disregard for the will of the people. And actually, right before we got on the Zoom, there was a very good example of that, which is a federal court just struck down for the second time these racially gerrymandered maps out of Alabama. And it's pretty amazing to look at this story, just to give one example of the threats of democracy we face. Alabama drew a map in a state that's 27% black, that only had one majority black congressional district. A federal court struck down those maps at the beginning of 2022. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to block those maps during the 2022 election, which meant there was basically an illegal election in the state of Alabama. Subsequently, the Supreme Court did strike down those maps in June of this year. They said to Alabama, you have to draw a second majority black congressional district. Alabama just flat out ignored the federal court, drew a new map that didn't include the second black congressional district that both the federal district court and the U.S. Supreme Court had said that it needed to do. And then just today, a federal court struck down the map again and basically said they can't even think of an example of a state doing something like this, where a court says you need to do something in the name of the Voting Rights Act, and the states basically saying we're not going to do it. And so that's just one small example of the kind of things we're seeing where politicians are desperate to hang on to power through things like gerrymandering, through things like voter suppression, and they're willing to go to increasingly extreme lengths, even to ignore federal courts, even to ignore conservative dominated federal courts in some cases to try to get what they want. So I think it's really important to try to focus on some of these other stories that really impact a lot of people when all the other focus is on Donald Trump.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more that Donald Trump is not exactly wanting for coverage relative to all the other things that are going on. So I think one of the things we want to definitely focus on, as we talk today is, the solutions here. So different kinds of policy reforms and efforts that we might cover as journalists in response to voter suppression, in response to gerrymandering. I guess I could ask both of you if there are policy efforts that you think are particularly worth putting a spotlight on. I know that myself, I covered, the For the People Act going through Congress and John Lewis Voting Rights Act, didn't get anywhere with those. So, are there, solutions, especially at the state and local level, that we should be looking into as journalists, as we sort of think about how to fight back against these threats? Maybe, Ari, you can go ahead and start this time.
Sure. That's a really good question. I will say, first off, your point about the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, there was this big opportunity, I think, to educate the public last year about what federal voting rights legislation would have done. And I think by and large, the media did a very bad job of covering it because they covered it through the lens of inside baseball. What's Joe Manchin going to do? What's Kyrsten Sinema going to do? What's President Biden saying about the filibuster right now, as opposed to what would the bill actually do? How would it transform American elections? How would it do things like provide early voting and provide automatic registration and get rid of partisan gerrymandering, things that are very popular with the public? When you ask everyday voters about these kind of things, they don't like gerrymandering. They want voting to be convenient. But so much of the fight over the federal legislation was about this inside baseball thing that I think turns a lot of voters off and stops paying attention. So I think that was an example where the media could have really spotlighted a potential solution and of course criticized it and critiqued it and said, does it do this and does it do that? But talked about this is what it would actually do. And it was so hard. It was like you'd read these stories and you'd have to get down to the 15th paragraph to try to figure out what the bill would actually do, because the first 14 was all about this infighting. So I think it's important to talk about the solutions that are out there. At the state level, it's interesting. The same number of states have passed laws making it easier to vote in the last 3 years as states have made it harder to vote. But there has been very little coverage of the states that have made it easier to vote, because the thinking is, oh, well, this is just happening in blue states or it's just being passed by Democrats. But regardless of where it's happening, I think it's important to show how it works, because I think, first off, that benefits a lot of people in those places, but also in the same way that voter suppression can be a national model, voter expansion can be a national model as well. And it gets a fraction of the coverage. So I'll just give you one example. I did a story back in 2016 about automatic voter registration in Oregon, because Oregon was the first state to do this, to start sort of say like, hey, the government knows all this information about us. If you're 18, you're automatically enrolled in the Selective Service. If there ever was to be a draft again, why can't we just automatically enroll people to register to vote? And this was a very simple idea, but it was also radical in its scope. And the reason why people started caring about this is because they saw that the political system was failing. And they saw that the first barrier to political participation is voter registration. If you're not registered to vote, then it's very hard to participate in the political process. And so this was a very simple idea. And I got deep into the mechanics of it. And I talked about not only what the policy would do, but why it mattered. That people, young people in particular, were pushing for this, and they were angry about a lack of action on climate change and a lack of action on racial and social justice and all of these things. And they were pushing for this policy, not just for the sake of expanding voting rights, but to try to achieve all of these other policy goals, which I think is really important in terms of trying to connect voting to things that people care about in their life. Because if it's all just about the mechanics of voting, it's going to be very dry to people. But if it's about voting as a means to an end, about policies that people actually care about, then I think you can engage a lot more people.
And in that same vein, I will add, what Ari just said, it's just spot on about what we can do as journalists to improve this and to keep the conversation moving forward is ensuring that, we cover the process a lot more. You'd be surprised at how many of these people that are spreading conspiracies have no idea of how elections actually work, and that elections are run at the local level, and that, every county, every state has different laws, different policies about their elections. And I think that's why it's so easy for these conspiracies to spread, and for them to be such a threat, because people aren't just don't know, that, a lot of people maybe have never worked an election or been an election worker, a poll worker, or, a poll watcher even. And so kind of putting that in the forefront and really explaining how our process works, whether that's a national level or in our states, in our counties, in the communities that we're covering as journalists, I think it's very important.
So Natalia, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about something you mentioned just now and also earlier about how, elections are administered at the local level. And what that means is a lot of power to shape elections and how, over how elections are run, sits in these offices that people really know about. Administration regulations that people really aren't aware of can be really meaningful and have a really big impact. So where are the places where journalists should be looking for those kinds of hidden threats to the democratic process? Are there sort of corners of election administration that you think ought to be covered more because they have like an outsized impact on how elections function relative to how obscure they might be?
Yeah, so I'll just also, just for everybody, just for clarity and to put it out there, I personally have never voted. I'm an immigrant. I just recently became a citizen. I'm 35 years old. I've never voted in this country or anywhere else. And I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to cover this topic. I've always wanted to vote. I just could never do it. And as someone who's going to vote for the first time, probably in November, this upcoming election, I am going into it, after reporting on the process and after talking to the people that actually run our elections, to the people that, make the election equipment and the things that we use when we go to the polls, especially here in Texas. I'm going to go to the polls and I'm going to just be so much more informed, as opposed to before when I was just really intimidated by the process just because I had never done it. And anyone who has never done it in this country could probably feel the same way, even if you're, 18, or like me, you're naturalized citizen, or maybe you're completed your parole and, you were incarcerated before and starting over and maybe voting for the first time because of that. What really helped me to understand this process and to report on it was to just call people at the local level who run our elections, to go to the elections department and really just kind of get a sense of how things work, to be there on election night and actually the weeks following the election after results are posted, what happens after, how does it work, to really understand, and be able to report on whether any of these, conspiracies or these, or these claims of misinformation that are getting spread are actually possible. So that's something that really helped me. And so I would encourage reporters who want to cover elections and voting to start there, or maybe volunteer to register people to vote, maybe, volunteer to work a poll one day to understand it and really build the relationship with the people that actually run our elections, which, are seriously just like our neighbors and members of our communities.
Right. All right, do you have any thoughts on kind of obscure and sort of hidden threats to the democratic process and elections functioning properly? I mean, a lot of attention gets focused on places like gerrymandering, on kind of high level restrictions on voting rights, but things like, the hours at which polling places are open matter. The things that you can give to people who are standing in line, that's been a subject of regulation from Republicans. So can you talk a little about those kinds of smaller but still significant threats that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, the little details matter a tremendous amount when it comes to elections. For example, Georgia did something where instead of being able to request a mail ballot online, you have to now print out a mail ballot application form. Well, that means you have to have access to a printer. A lot of people don't have access to a printer. A lot of people just do things on their phones. A lot of people don't even have computers nowadays. And so this is a very small thing that basically made it impossible for voters to request mail ballots in large numbers in the state of Georgia. And it didn't get nearly as much attention as a lot of other things that was in that sweeping law passed by the Georgia legislature in 2021. And so I would say a lot of the little details matter a lot. I would also say that so much of the fights and so much of what happens on voting rights happens at the state level. And it's great that there's been more investment in this and people like Natalia covering states like Texas. But I mean, you compare the Washington press score to the state capitol press scores in Texas or in Ohio or North Carolina or wherever, and it's a fraction of the size. And in many ways, state legislatures are the most powerful yet undercovered bodies in American politics. They determine so many things, not just on voting rights, but on so many other issues. And they don't get nearly the attention they deserve because they don't have, in many ways, the press scores that are following them like they used to in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so that's a lot of what I follow. And I often have to rely on people who are down there because I can only be in so many places at once. And so I think that's really critical in terms of looking at is just investing much more in the states. And again, that is something I'm concerned about next year when so much attention is going to be directed towards these trials that Trump is facing. Who's going to be covering the state legislatures that are going to be back in effect? Most states, if they're not in session now, they're going to be going back at the beginning of next year. And who knows what they're going to do as they prepare for a presidential election, and particularly Republican state legislatures, knowing that the candidate they're about to nominate is going to be facing all of this scrutiny, and they're probably going to try to insulate and benefit him in one way or after the other.
Natalia, what you just mentioned just before Ollie spoke was so important about how you're planning on voting, perhaps for the first time in this upcoming election. And I think that would be a good way to sort of talk about how we can cover these threats to democracy, specifically for marginalized communities of different kinds, where it can be hard for the big traditional outlets to reach, immigrant communities, Spanish-speaking communities, and those are communities that are often at the front line of this battle, communities that are being specifically targeted for disenfranchisement. So, what are the ways in which we can stay on top of the threats to the marginalized communities ahead of this upcoming election, and also ensure that the reporting on those threats actually reaches the communities that need them the most?
Yeah, just like Ari was saying earlier, those little details matter so much, I think, for us as journalists, understanding really how our process works at the local level, what our law says about mail-in voting. How do we vote by mail in Texas? And, are those, if we know that we have a large multi-language, speaking community other than English, do we know whether our counties are translating those instructions into other languages? What does the law say about that? Maybe we need to kind of bring that to the forefront if that hasn't been the case. How the polls work. I mean, are they accessible also to people with disabilities? In Texas, for people with disabilities, it's getting a little easier to vote, but it's still not where we should be. So just kind of really, that's why those little details, and us as journalists understanding how our process works at the local level, at the state level, is very important, because then we can then bring those issues to the forefront. But then, like you said, in order to reach those communities that we're trying to, get that information out there, I think that's going to vary by newsroom. I think our industry still has a lot of work to do when it comes to that. I mean, resources are shrinking in newsrooms. at VoteBeat, at least, we partner with other outlets. Our articles are free to republish. Anyone can republish our articles. TV stations, newspapers can republish, but also we try to reach out to local radio stations. We also know that one project that I at least personally want to do later on, I know that a lot of immigrant communities are on other platforms besides Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. I mean, there's WhatsApp, and those are kind of ways that we kind of want to explore in the future, reaching more communities and maybe translating more stories. But that takes resources. And I think our industry really kind of has to do a shift there to really focus on this topic of democracy, which is, arguably, I think the most important one in this moment in our history in this country. So I think it has to do with us really paying attention, understanding how our process of elections work, but also our industry and our newsrooms really investing in this as well, so that we can reach the people that we need to reach, the voters.
Absolutely. All right, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on sustaining interest in this subject off campaign season. I think that one of the reasons why we're here is because we have this election coming up that everybody is sort of focused on, obviously. But the story doesn't end when the election is over. A lot of these suppression laws happen between elections, obviously. But also, you mentioned something before that I think is really important to remember. There has been less coverage of voting rights in the blue states, right? Because it's assumed, well, first of all, Republicans don't control those states. But also it's kind of assumed that those parts of the country aren't places where the health of democracy is like a live and active concern. But it's tremendously important for people to be able to vote in Baltimore, where I live, even though it's a heavily Democratic city. It's important for people to vote in state and local elections. So how do we sort of broaden people's interest in the health of democracy and threats to democracy beyond just what's going to happen in this next presidential election? How do we sustain these conversations moving forward?
Great question. It's kind of like a sports team. What happens in the off season is going to determine in a lot of ways how you perform in the regular season. And I think a lot of what's happening right now is going to shape what the main elections look like, just like in a lot of ways what happened after the 2020 election in 2021 shaped what was going to happen in 2022 and is still shaping it now. And so I think it's important just to talk about the fact that it's not like elections just suddenly happen. A lot of it goes into it, and what the rules are, what the playing field is going to be like, that is determined well in advance. And also the ability to do something about it is determined well in advance, because people always contact me a month before the election and say, what can I do? And, I try to tell them things to do, but it's a lot easier to achieve those things a year before the election, when things like how many polling places are there going to be? Where are they going to be put? What are the early voting hours going to be? How many election workers will there be? All of that stuff is determined well in advance of the election. If you just start paying attention to this kind of thing right before the election, you're going to miss all the decisions that go into this. So I think that's a really good point. I just want to add something to what Natalia said about reporting on marginalized communities, which is that it's very difficult to do this from behind a desk. I know from experience about this, that you really have to go into the communities that are facing these kind of threats to democracy, and remember that things like voter suppression exacerbate existing socioeconomic disparities. And so you have to understand what those disparities are to understand what the impacts of these laws might be. And it really frustrates me when I hear these elite political journalists in places like New York and Washington say, oh, well, this or that law is not going to have any impact. Well, how do they know? Have they interviewed people that have waited for 10 hours to vote? Have they interviewed people that can't get an ID or have problems with an ID for some reason or another? Have they interviewed people that have been purged from the rolls? Have they interviewed people who have had their polling places shut? Have they interviewed people who can only get to the polls on the weekends because they work during the week? I mean, there's so many things that go into whether or not someone could or could not be able to vote. And for someone like me to make the judgment that I know that this makes it hard to vote, this makes it easier to vote, I think you have to really talk to people about that. And I think there's this, I would say in general, and I imagine you both agree, I think there's just the kind of this elitist bias in so much of the media, because so much of the media is in places like Washington and New York and Los Angeles. And those places are great. I mean, I live in New York. I don't live in New York City anymore, but I live in New York State. But the fact is, I mean, so much of the suppression is not happening in those places. It's happening in other places. It's happening in Texas. It's happening in Ohio. It's happening in North Carolina, Wisconsin. You have to go out and report on those places to try to understand them. And the last thing I'll say about why does it matter what a blue state does, it's because the states are national battles right now, and every state is looking at what another state was doing. And back after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, North Carolina passed this big rewrite of their election laws. And one of the things they did was they cut early voting, and they cut early voting on Sundays when Black churches do souls to the polls voter mobilization drives. And when asked to defend that law in court, the lawyers for the state of North Carolina pointed to the fact that New York had no early voting. And they said, well, North Carolina still has 10 days of early voting. So what does it matter if we cut 1 day of Sunday voting if we have 10 days of early voting and New York has none? And there's all sorts of reasons why it wasn't an apples to apples comparison, but it was true that at that time, New York had no early voting. That was bad for New Yorkers in one of the biggest states in the country, but it was also bad because then it gave people in North Carolina an excuse to suppress voting rights by pointing to New York. And so now New York has early voting. It's not the greatest state still for voting rights. There's still lots of problems with voting here. But I think that at least both benefits people here and takes away an argument that other states can use to say this is why we can suppress voting rights.
Right. So I have one more question before we're going to turn it over to questions that people have submitted prior to this seminar, and I think a few questions people have submitted during the seminar. Before I get to that question, I did want to add to something that Ari said, and I think Ari, you made so many important points there. I do encounter myself when covering democratic reform, democracy policy, basically in general. What you said, this attitude where you have a lot of elite journalists saying, well, does this or that effort to restrict voting rights really matter? And I think a lot of the conversations revolve around whether or not those restrictions on voting rights will actually impact the results of an election, which is important, but also not really the point. I mean, even in a place where, elections aren't very close, even in a blue state, voting is a right that we're supposed to be able to exercise pretty easily. And if you've made it hard for somebody to exercise that right, if you make it a hassle for them to show up to the polls or to turn in their ballot, you've materially worsened someone's life, in a way that matters, even if that impact doesn't actually change the outcome of an election. You are still having a concrete impact in the ways that people experience democracy, and that has real costs, even if it doesn't actually affect the margin of the election. So I think that's an important part that you made that I wish more journalists took seriously. So the last question I wanted to ask both of you is just whether there are stories that either of you have done lately on voting rights that you especially want to talk about or highlight, that you maybe focused spotlight on the corner of this issue that hadn't really gotten very much attention. Maybe there's a success story, there's a policy matter that you think people should be more aware of. Just anything that either of you worked on recently that you think people tuning in should check out.
Ari, I'll let you go first.
I did a story in June about the 10th anniversary of the Supreme Court gutting the Voting Rights Act. And I thought it was a really important story because it took stock of what has occurred over the past decade. And I think that a lot of people point to the radicalization of the Republican Party against democracy to Donald Trump. And in fact, it predates Donald Trump. And this is a point that I keep trying to make like a broken record over and over and over, because Donald Trump was still ensconced in Trump Tower when the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013. He had nothing to do with that decision. That was part of a broader hostility to democracy that has taken place for a long time. And I wanted people to understand that this decision had an enormous impact on the political landscape over the past decade. And for me, it was really the gutting of the Voting Rights Act that opened my eyes to the importance of voting rights. I had been covering voting rights before this, but it was this decision that really crystallized that, as you said, Osita, what should be the most fundamental right in democracy remains the most contested. And I think sometimes we have to take a broader look at things and understand that voter suppression doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of a very dark chapter in American history that there's been lots of fights to try to erase, but there are still people that are very motivated today to turn the vote into a privilege instead of a right. And that's something that happened before Trump. It's accelerated with Trump. But I think in general, taking a broader view of the landscape in America and understanding that there are people that want to make it harder to vote for a very specific reason, because they're afraid of popular majorities. They're afraid of the will of the people. They want to implement unpopular and extreme policies without having the regular checks and balances that should apply to society. And I think the gutting of the Voting Rights Act is not the only thing that reflects that, but I think in many ways it's a microcosm of the anti-democratic turn that America has taken over the past decade.
Natalia, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I worked on a profile on an election official, and I talked about this earlier. As I kind of dove into this topic myself, one of my best sources were the people that actually ran elections. And in North Texas, the elections director of the department there, his name is Hyder Garcia, person of color in this county where most of the people spreading misinformation and spreading conspiracy theories specifically against him and threatening his life, his family, just making racist comments about this election official. He kind of like found a way to bring these people in, listening to them, even after, like I said, they were threatening him and, making up stuff about him, and kind of just worked with them. And these people that were spreading conspiracies about him actually learned about the elections process and learned to respect him and the knowledge he has. But this story also kind of dove into the importance of election, like at the local level, our county elected officials supporting our election directors and our election administrators, not just through, words of support, but just like giving them the resources that they need and just kind of like standing behind them. And in this specific example, the county officials were Republican also, but didn't buy into the conspiracies or didn't buy into the misinformation, and backed up this guy Hyder, who is the expert and the person actually running elections, which is something that at the local level is very important for elections departments to have the county buying in the support and also providing the resources that election officials need. And by resources, I mean the money to hire workers, the money to hire the correct equipment, the more workers at a polling location, the less lines that we see at the polls. And, it all kind of works together. And I think this was like a really good, at least for us at VoteBeat, to kind of like explain all of these things through the lens of this person and what he did and how he made it work.
Terrific. So people submitted a lot of questions, both before this seminar, and I think, a few during the seminar. So let's see if we can do a few of those before it's time for us to go. And the first one is for both of you, I guess. So how have your approaches to covering threats to democracy changed over the years? Maybe Ari, you can start with that. I mean, you just referenced the Supreme Court decision that happened 10 years ago. In that decade or so of voting rights policy, has your approach to covering this issue changed?
Well, it's become so much more of a 5-alarm fire than it used to be. It used to be that, I started covering it, and again, I started covering this issue after the 2010 election, which is when a lot of states flipped political control, and we began to see a lot of these new measures being introduced to make it harder to vote. But it was more like there was one law passed in one state. And now it's like the Texas law that passed in 2021 or the Georgia law, there's 16 different provisions in there that you have to try to understand, and they're complicated, and you have to try to explain it to people, and you have to try to report it out. So it's a lot more work to keep up with what's happening. The scope of the anti-democratic efforts has radically enlarged. I mean, we were mostly talking, in the kind of last decade about barriers to the ballot box, right? But then Trump introduced this whole concept of just trying to overturn elections altogether, right? And so now you have voter suppression on the front end, but then you also have voter suppression on the back end, right? And I think that the effort to try to overturn the 2020 election was much more reflective of a broader radicalization against democracy that exists, that both tries to overturn elections, but also is trying to do lots of other anti-democratic things as well. And there's a whole constellation of conservative groups that are working on these issues, some of which are working on it before, but there's many more of them now. And as Natalia can talk about, there's a lot more people at the local level that are pushing for these things. And sometimes it's top down, but other times it's bottom up, in that it's not just something that kind of elite members of the Republican Party care about. It might be a lot of people at the grassroots level that have been whipped up into a frenzy by things they have heard. And so that is really challenging. And then just feeling like, we're trying to report the truth, but a lot of people just don't care. And I have often found myself in this position where I felt like the work I'm doing is more important than ever, but sometimes it feels like it's having less impact than ever, just because so many people just refuse to believe things that are empirically true. And I'm not sure any of us have figured out a good answer to that. I mean, we can try to interview all of the sane Republicans that we want. We can try to talk to all the local clerks who are very conservative, but just committed to running good elections. We can try to spotlight all these people, and that has some kind of an impact. But like, how do we as journalists who work for nonprofit outlets, try to combat the tremendous amount of corporate and huge billionaire-backed money that is invested in pushing out propaganda every single day? And so I think it's a really, really challenging time to try to cover democracy. It's not something that one person can cover. It's not something that one outlet can cover. It really has to be an all-hands-on-deck moment because of the different threats to democracy that we face and how they're radically enlarging and metastasizing at all times now.
Agreed on all on all of what Ari said, but I think too that's why I mentioned earlier just how important it is that our newsrooms and our industry is buying into this. It's not just it shouldn't just be one person in our newsrooms. I think this just takes a lot of work, and it is a lot. At VoteBeat, at least we are trying to take this approach of since we only cover voting and election administration, we don't really cover the politicians. We don't really cover their campaigns or anything like that. We have an opportunity to really think about in our editorial meetings, how did this policy that's coming up is going to change elections? Is it going to make it better? Is it going to make it worse? How is it going to impact the voters? Is it going to make it easier to vote or not? So we kind of are having these conversations in our editorial meetings constantly about whether it would be worth it to do a story on just something someone said or something that everybody is panicking about if we don't have enough information yet, or if it's not going to change anything in that moment. Like, can we go deeper? Can we dive deeper? So, and it's also because we have a limited amount of resources. Our newsroom is new, it's small too, but that's why we kind of have to make those decisions and have those conversations with editors constantly, with our editors constantly, about how we can cover something in a way that's smart and in a way that, it's going to be helpful to voters, and in a way that we are really going to hold, a lawmaker accountable. And sometimes that takes time and it takes resources, but that's why I keep going back to, it's something that our industry and our newsrooms really, really, really have to buy into as well. It can't just be on the beat reporter.
Right. So another question for both of you, and I think it touches upon something that both of you talked about a little bit already. What strategies do you have for getting outside the newsroom to make a voter suppression story more human focused?
Well, I think it's just that. It's to make it human focused, to not make it about numbers and laws and things that can lose people. If you look at litigation, for example, every lawsuit has two names, and I'm always thinking, who are those names? A lot of times It's just a regular person that might be challenging this law, and that person can have a really interesting backstory. Getting out into the community, as Natalia said, reporting on people that are subject to these threats of democracy or people who are pushing back on them. I think that generally speaking, there's a lot of compelling stories there to tell, and then just talking about the impact on real people, because it's easy to argue something abstract. It's harder to argue when you tell the story of someone who's had to wait 10 hours to vote, or someone who's been purged from the voting rolls, or someone who didn't have the underlying documents necessary to get the right ID. I mean, those are things that are harder than to rebut, and they have more power. And often people want to vote for very specific reasons. They want to vote for things in their lives to improve. And during the civil rights movement, when John Lewis and Martin Luther King and so many others were marching for the Voting Rights Act, they weren't just marching for the right to vote for the sake of the right to vote. They were marching for the right to vote because they wanted better jobs and better schools and better housing, and to be treated as equal citizens and with basic human dignity. That's what the vote was about. The Voting Rights Act was a means to an end. I think it's really important to always remind people of that these fights about voting rights aren't about voting rights. They're about much bigger things and the kind of society that we want to create. And some people are pushing to expand voting rights because they want to create a certain kind of society, and certain people are trying to restrict voting rights because they want to maintain a certain kind of society. And I think it's important to always try to talk about the stakes of these things beyond just the X's and O's of some kind of court or legislative fight.
Yeah, and I think that, most of us, cover our specific communities, right? And we talked about this earlier. We know our communities and we're out there. We have the sourcing already. We just need to be talking to those people constantly. And if we are going to cover elections, if we are going to cover voting, we have to be there on election night. Just seeing how it works and how, what voters are experiencing at the polls, talking to them right there, just getting more contacts. And that's what we're trying to do in our newsroom. But it shouldn't just be that night, right? Like on election night, and then the results are in, and then that's it. I think we keep talking to voters after that, because our laws keep changing. There are, just like Ari was saying earlier, our laws it's even more now than before, that lawmakers are focusing on voting and voting access and how we vote in each of our states. And so how that impacts a voter, it's going to go beyond just that night. So I think just being there, and most of us are in our communities already. So we just, that's just what we have to do, just talk to people.
On that point about being attuned to what's going on in our communities, this question touches upon something that also was discussed in our last panel, and also a little bit, I think, today. But maybe both of you could talk a little bit about how we can combat alternative facts and misinformation in communities of color.
I can try to chime in on this. I think that we really need to understand where our communities are. Are they mostly tuned in to their TV station, to their radio station? Do they spend most time at work? When they come home, they don't have time to kind of be reading articles or be on social media that much. And if they are, they're probably on different platforms that the ones that, white speaking communities or, white communities use mostly. So I think each newsroom can really benefit from just like honestly diversifying their staff, but also really working hand in hand with like our engagement teams who are, the experts on this. But when we're reporting on the ground in our communities, one thing that has been helpful for me before and even now, it's like, where do you get your news? A lot of times you'd be surprised, even if you work for a local newspaper that's been around for centuries. Communities of color, marginalized communities probably don't know what the paper is, probably don't read it, probably don't get their news from there. So where do you get your news? Is that your schools, like your kids, the school's newsletter that they send, because they're constantly getting information there too locally. Is it, like I said, radio station, a TV station, just asking people where they're getting their information from? It's been what's been helpful for me, because like I said, I think in our industry, we just kind of think that people just know us and that we're there. But most of the time that's not true. So just asking those questions of our readers, our sources, everybody.
All right, do you want to chime in with anything on that?
Sure. I think Natalia put it really well. I would just say that from my perspective, it's really important to try to diversify my sources as much as I can. I mean, I am who I am, right? So I came from a specific kind of background. Other people come from a different kind of background. And so if I want to understand those communities that I wasn't born into, I have to work to do that, right? And I have to make sure that I'm identifying those on the ground stories and I'm embedding in those communities and I'm understanding those communities. And I think that people are very receptive to doing that. I've been all over reporting on voting rights, and I think that I've understood a lot better, not just about voting rights, but about the country writ large through a lot of these experiences. But I've had to work at it and I've had to cultivate these things. And it's not something that is necessarily super easy. And you can't always just do it by sending someone a text or connecting with someone on Twitter, right? I mean, you have to often, to identify some kind of sources in my story, I have to do many, many, many layers of digging, right? I have to talk to different groups who have to put me in touch with different people, and I have to talk to those people, and then I often have to go down there, and it takes time. And so this is a process, and just like any kind of reporting, if you really want to become good at it and effective on it, you have to put in the work, and there's really no substitute for doing it. So I think we have to diversify our newsrooms, and I also think we have to diversify our sources as well.
One last question from the chat. Right now, among legacy and major media, are there editors who are demonstrating real leadership on democracy journalism? And I guess, one way to broaden out this question is just, are there outlets that you think are doing model work in this field and reporting the threats of democracy, voting rights, democratic reform? Where should people be reading for sort of examples of what they can do as journalists and sort of the best out of covering this field? I don't know, either of you can take that on. Maybe Ari, you can start.
Sure, I can start. Well, I think in general, one of the things that has been really gratifying is that a lot more people are covering this issue now. This issue of democracy. When I started covering voting rights, there weren't a lot of other reporters that were covering this issue. Now there's a lot more people that are covering it. I think we have to be important not to silo democracy as one of many issues, but really talk about how democracy affects every issue. And I think whether you're reporting on reproductive rights, or you're reporting on climate change, or you're reporting on racial justice, I mean, what's happening to our democracy affects all of those issues too, immigration, et cetera, et cetera. So I think one thing that I think newsrooms could do better was trying to integrate how threats to democracy affect all these other issues that are thought of as separate, but really are connected. There's a lot of new outlets that have formed recently that I think are doing great work. VoteBeat, obviously. Bolts is another one that's really great in kind of covering the mechanics of voting, election administration, things like that. There's probably people on this chat know a lot more than I do about all the new things that have been started, but I think it's gratifying to see more investment at the state and local level. I think we need to see a lot more of that, quite frankly, because I think that a lot of these places are still very understaffed. And then I think the problem is that for every journalist we gain, there's 10 more we lose. And I think that, I rely on the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel and the Atlanta Journal Constitution and the Palm Beach Post and all of these places to be able to do my job. And readers rely on them to know what's happening in their communities. And all of these places are just subject to so many cuts. We've been lucky at Mother Jones not to have that. I think there's a lot of the nonprofits have been doing better. But we need to understand that the crisis of journalism is also a crisis for democracy, and that these two things go hand in hand. If we don't have a strong, vibrant press reporting on threats to democracy, it's going to be very hard to be able to combat them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also going to name Bolts as well. They're doing a really great work over there. But I also rely on mostly Texas newspapers who are also doing, I mean, we're going through the trial of the impeachment of the Attorney General here, and local newspapers having covering that inside and out and doing great work. But that does take resources. It takes a lot of time, and it takes, like Ari was saying, just giving journalists the time and giving us the opportunity to do it, and creating these opportunities. And I think I am really glad to see that there's more B positions that have been created for this. I just hope that it's not just for election season and just for one moment, but that we can be here, for the aftermath and what happens after that. And, more legislative processes, because like we were saying earlier, everything that happens in between an election season or a campaign season, it's so important to that day, to election day, and what happens there. So I hope to see more of that, and that those positions really do stick around permanently if we can.
Terrific. This has been a really, really wonderful conversation. Thank you, Ari and Natalia, for being here. I hope everybody got a lot out of this. I know that I did. I think that Jessel has a couple of notes for us before we sign off, but I just wanted to say thank you both for doing this and for being generous in your time.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you. This was great.
Yeah, big shout out to Ari, Natalia, and Osita. That was a fantastic conversation. So many great takeaways, so many great insights. And we'll share this recording with you. We're working on resources to really, comb through these. We've already had 3 hours of discussions. We'll have 1 more hour next week. And we're gonna, give you the main action points you can use in your reporting, and we'll send that out in the next few weeks. And on that question of model newsrooms and model newsroom leaders, if you're curious about that, or if you're a newsroom leader and want to know the changes that you can make in your newsrooms, we actually have a session about that next week. Lessons from pro-democracy newsrooms. We'll have 5 takeaways that the newsroom leaders from VoteBeat, Prism, and Texas Tribune will be talking about, and the real impacts that these doing pro-democracy reporting, centering communities and not just politicians, the real amazing impacts that reporting has done to these newsrooms. Texas Tribune had a pro-democracy voter-centered voting guide in 2022, and they had the greatest traffic go to that piece of reporting they did, which they surveyed something like 1,700 of their readers, and they created a voting guide based on that, centering the issues and not the candidates. Prism Reports has done great stuff, and obviously VoteBeat has done fantastic work too, and they have evidence to show that hard work pays off. Democracy Day, don't forget Democracy Day, September 15th. Anyone can sign up, reporter, newsroom, sign up and participate. Post 1 piece of pro-democracy content on your website. There's tons of free content you can get from US Democracy Day. The link is in the chat. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Jessel Noor with Solutions Journalism Network.
Thanks, everyone.